go where no one has gone before, to the far side of the moon.
So the rocket carrying a lunar lander blasted off Saturday to start this 26-day journey. The mission is to put a remotely controlled rover on the surface to do some deep space listening, that's a thing, and look for evidence of water. And I spoke to retired NASA astronaut Leroy Chiao about the mission and what we can learn.
This is actually a very exciting mission. As you just said, this will be the first time that any nation or entity has tried to put a probe on the far side of the moon. We know a little bit about the far side of the moon. We believe the craters are smaller there, and it's going to be the first time we put a probe there, so it's going to do a lot of different measurements. There's certain technical complexities. For example, the Chinese had to launch a relay satellite back in May so it could relay the radio signals back to Earth and instructions to the satellite or to the spacecraft as well. And so what this spacecraft will do, it's going to analyze the structure underground using ground penetrating radar, and it's going to do a little radio astronomy, being shielded from all the radio transmissions from the Earth. It'll be able to do measurements that wouldn't otherwise be really possible. And it's also going to see if it can grow some plants there in the reduced gravity environment of the moon.
Let's talk about NASA. This was supposed to have been a landmark year for the U.S. Space program. Let me take you back to 2005 when the NASA then released a plan that declared, and these are quotes, "In 2018, humans will return to the moon. NASA astronauts will again explore the surface of the moon, and this time we're going to stay, building outposts and paving the way for eventual journeys to Mars and beyond." Now, the Trump administration says they want to return to that in 2019 with their budget priorities, but how far is NASA from doing what they said they wanted to do in 2018?
Well, unfortunately, this is kind of a repeating pattern. And so, when I was selected as an astronaut way back in 1990, that was a very exciting time too. President Bush 41 announced the exploration initiative to send humans to Mars by 2019. And what a great time to be joining NASA. And of course, none of that panned out. So unfortunately, what you're seeing is, grand ideas. The funding, for one reason or another, doesn't materialize. There's some other problems. And so right now, there is a pivot back towards the moon, as you know, under the new administration, which I think is the right thing to do.
The U.S. spends more on its space program than the Russians, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Europeans, far more. But it's the Chinese who are going to the far side of the moon. When an astronaut wants to go to the International Space Station, they have to hitch a ride on a Russian vessel. Is the U.S. still dominating in space? Is that disparity in spending reflective of U.S. dominance?
Well, first of all, you're right. We do spend more on space exploration than any other country. However, put that in context in that right now the NASA budget is at about 0.4% of the total U.S. budget. And at the peak of the Apollo program, it was much closer to 5%. So the proportional amount of money that NASA receives these days is a far cry from what it used to be. Your question about whether China is going to take over, that's a real concern because they are up and coming. The Chinese government is committed to this long-term program. They're doing ambitious missions to the moon. They're also planning to send rovers to Mars. And they've even announced, although not with a date, their intention to land their astronauts on the moon. And so they are definitely planning for the long haul, whereas, frankly, our government is, and it's not NASA's fault. I would put that onto the White House and the Congress. They need to decide what we as a nation want to do, and if we want to continue to lead in space, which I think we absolutely should.
All right, we will see what we learn from this robotic probe from China and what's ahead next for NASA. Leroy Chiao, always good to have you.
Always a pleasure. Thanks.